In this video, we will be disassembling the Kawasaki FX921V 31 horsepower engine. To begin, we will remove the rain cap. This is held on by a worm clamp with one standard head screw. We can then remove our air filter case, held on by a retaining clip on each side. This will reveal our air filter element that we can then remove, followed by our secondary element. And our air filter housing does have a bracket that needs to be removed. And at the rear of our bracket, we have one 12mm bolt that needs to be removed, and that will allow us to remove that bracket. Our air filter case is held on at one connection point. Using a standard head screwdriver, we can loosen our worm clamp, and then we can work that unit off. Our air filter tube is also held on at one connection point, again with a worm clamp and one standard head screw. And we can work that off as well. And that will give us good access to the other half of our bracket, which is held on by three fasteners. One 12mm nut and two 10mm bolts. On the top of the engine, we have a guard to remove next. This is held on by three 10mm bolts, and that guard should lift straight off. And we will next shift focus to the fuel pump mounted to the side of the engine. Taking a closer look, we have two 10mm bolts holding our fuel pump bracket onto the engine. This will allow our fuel pump and bracket to become loose. However, we are still connected on by a couple fuel lines. Using some adjustable pliers, we can release tension from the spring clamp and work that down the fuel line. And very carefully, using a twisting motion and very light pressure, we're going to work that fuel line off of the hose barb on the fuel pump. And we're going to follow the same procedure for the other fuel line that is connected to the fuel pump. And this will allow us to remove that fuel pump from the engine. And we can then shift our focus to our voltage regulator. We have two electrical connections and two fasteners. Using a T25 Torx driver, we can remove those two fasteners. And disconnect that wiring harness. On the other side of our engine, we have an oil cooler, which is held on by two 10mm fasteners. And at the base of the oil cooler, we do have two oil lines. Removing the two 10mm fasteners first will free up that oil cooler and provide us some flexibility on those oil lines. And then we can work those oil lines off. Shifting our focus back to the top of the engine, we have a screen to remove next. This is held on by four T30 Torx head fasteners. If we take a look at our fan housing, we should have removed all of the components that would have hindered us from removing this. This is held on by a series of 10mm fasteners around the perimeter of that fan housing. In total, there were 3 10mm fasteners, and this should allow us to remove that fan cover. Locating the starter, we have 2 12mm bolts holding this in place. And as we remove those fasteners, we do want to hang on to our bracket on one side, as well as our ground wire on the other side. Additionally, we do want to support the starter so it does not fall out of the engine. And I am going to replace those bolts in the same location so I don't lose them. And we can go ahead and unscrew our oil filter. You might want to have a drip pan or rag underneath that. Taking a look at the side of the engine with our carburetor, and that had our air intake components. To the left of the carburetor, we have our number 1 cylinder side. To the right of the carburetor, we have our number 2 cylinder side. We are going to start by focusing on the number 2 cylinder side of the engine. On this side, being the number 2 cylinder side, we have a shroud that wraps around a good portion of the number 2 cylinder. This is held on by a series of 10mm bolts, which we can remove next. In total, there are 5 10mm fasteners holding on this shroud. And we will want to disconnect our spark plug wire and remove that from this shroud so we can work that shroud off of the engine. We can then shift our focus to cylinder 1 side of the engine. We are also removing the shroud. However, we do want to be aware of a wiring harness that is clipped underneath the shroud on one side, as well as the opposite side. And again, there are 5 10mm fasteners. And we will also need to feed those wires through that shroud. And once again, disconnecting that spark plug wire should free that shroud to be able to be worked around cylinder number 1. And we can remove those spark plugs from both cylinders. Shifting focus up top by the flywheel, we have 2 ignition coils. These are held on by 2 fasteners each, and we also have a wiring harness to disconnect. And we will first start with the ignition coil on cylinder side 2. And using some needle nose pliers, we can gently work off that wiring harness, followed by those 2 10mm fasteners. Switching over to cylinder side number 1, the procedure is very similar. We do have 2 wires connected to this ignition coil. And we also have those 2 fasteners. Shifting our focus back to the carburetor side of the engine, we have our pipe intake, This is held on by 4 fasteners. Each of these fasteners is 10 millimeter. We have 2 10 millimeter nuts in 2 of the corners and 2 10 millimeter bolts in the other 2 corners. Now, before we remove this, a couple things to consider. We have an air filter tube that is connected to the bottom of this, and we have a ground wire connected as well. We can go ahead and remove that ground wire and then gently work that off. We can then work our spring clamp off and that tube off as well. And we now have access to our component control panel. Although this item is loose, we are still connected by a spring on the back side. And as we work that off, we can remove the spring at the bottom. Taking a look from our carburetor side of the engine again, our carburetor is loose. We are, however, held on by a spring and governor rod, and that is then connected to our governor arm. If we loosen up our pinch bolt, we should be able to slide off the carburetor and governor arm altogether. But we want to first disconnect our 1 wiring harness, and then that should be able to be removed. And behind that carburetor, we do have an insulator that we can remove next. And this should give us clear access for removing our intake manifold, which has 6 10 millimeter fasteners. And that intake manifold should be free. We can then use a strap wrench to hold our flywheel for loosening our flywheel bolt and spin that flywheel bolt out. And with that flywheel bolt removed, we're going to remove our 4 studs. This is using a 10 millimeter socket wrench. And that plate and spacer can then be removed. And this will also allow us to remove our fan. And prior to removing the flywheel, I am going to reinstall the flywheel bolt. To remove the flywheel, we will be using a gear puller. Now, it is highly recommended that an official flywheel puller be used for this task because you do run the risk of damaging the teeth on the flywheel. Those teeth do interact with the starter. And we can remove that bolt again. And you will want to make sure that you remove the flywheel key and that you do not lose that key. Back to our carburetor side of the engine, we will be working on cylinder 2. Taking a look at our rocker cover for cylinder number 2, we can see 4 10 millimeter fasteners. And you will want to hang on to that rocker cover so it doesn't fall off. And we do have a gasket that you can very carefully remove. At this point, we will be removing the cylinder head for cylinder number 2. This is held on by 5 14mm fasteners. And when loosening these, I am going to jump around in a star-shaped pattern. And when removed, we will have 5 14mm bolts with washers, our cylinder head assembly with all of our valve components, and 2 push rods. One is shorter than the other one. Something to keep in mind during reassembly. Taking a look at our cylinder head, we have our exhaust side with 1 valve, and we have our intake side with 2 valves. We know this because if we rotate the exhaust side, we can see the port which the exhaust system is hooked to. If we take a look at the other side, we can see the intake port which is connected to our intake manifold. Looking at our intake side, we have a rocker shaft that can be removed. And that rocker arm as well. On the exhaust side, we have a 10mm nut and bolt. Now this also has a washer on it. And on that exhaust rocker, we also have a rocker shaft. On the underside of the cylinder head, we're going to place a few rags to help hold the valves in place. With those rags underneath the cylinder head, we can use a couple of additional rags to protect our thumbs as we press down on the valve retainer and work those keepers out of there. We can then work that exhaust valve out, and we have 5 total components. We have a valve retainer, spring, 2 keepers, and our exhaust valve. And this process will be repeated 2 additional times for the intake side. It does help to use a rag to protect your thumbs when we are depressing the springs. And it does help to have a partner with a small standard head screwdriver to help remove those keepers. Now it is very important to not lose the keepers, or you will run into problems during assembly. And then we can flip that cylinder head over and remove both of those valves and set them aside. On the intake side, we have a total of 10 components, 4 keepers, 2 retainers, 2 springs, and 2 intake valves. And that concludes disassembly of the cylinder head for cylinder number 2. And I am going to grab that gasket off of there just so I don't lose that. With cylinder side number 2 completed, we're going to shift over to cylinder side number 1. And we again have 4 10mm fasteners for rocker cover on cylinder side number 1. And you will want to support that rocker cover. And that cylinder head again has 5 14mm bolts. And I am jumping around on those bolts in a star-shaped pattern, as well as supporting that cylinder head as I remove the last of the bolts. And I have my cylinder head assembly, 2 push rods, and that head gasket did come off this time. I also have my rocker gasket that I want to take care of. And much like the other side, I have my rocker shaft for that intake side, and a 10mm bolt and nut on the exhaust side. With that washer, that rocker shaft in the center. We can then work through our process for removing the keepers, the valve retainers, as well as the valve springs for both the intake and exhaust side. In total, we have 15 components. On our intake side, we have 2 valves, 2 springs, 2 retainers, and 4 keepers. On our exhaust side, we have 1 valve, 1 spring, 1 retainer, and 2 keepers. And that concludes disassembly of the cylinder head for cylinder side number 1. At this point, we should be able to remove the crankcase cover. There are a series of 11 14mm bolts around the perimeter of this cover. We want to remove the fasteners in sequence according to the manufacturer. I like to do this in step sequence. So I will first loosen it a little bit, work my way around the sequence, come back and loosen it a little bit again, work my way around again, and continue to do that until all of the bolts are loose. The goal is to release pressure evenly on the crankcase cover. This will hopefully reduce any possible damage as we remove this component. Taking a look at the engine side opposite of the carburetor, this is the side opposite of the cylinder 1 and cylinder 2 that we were just working on. We have 2 locations for separating the engine. Using a pry bar or standard head screwdriver, we can very gently work the crankcase cover off, and we only want to apply enough force just to separate these components slightly. We can then work off that crankcase cover. With a rag, we can work the camshaft out. And with that camshaft removed, we can remove our 4 tappets. And at this point, we want to slightly rotate the engine to get access to our fasteners holding our end cap to the connecting rod. These are 10mm fasteners, and we will be working on the outermost piston. This is the piston that correlates with cylinder number 1. And we can then work that piston up through the cylinder. And make sure you are hanging on to the piston so it doesn't land on the floor. And then we can loosely reassemble that piston. And we will perform that same procedure for the piston on the back side, which correlates to cylinder side number 2. This also has 2 10mm bolts. And again, we're going to push that piston out, being very careful that it does not land on the floor. And loosely reassemble that together. And then we can work our crankshaft out of the engine. And with the final pieces removed, this has concluded our disassembly procedures for the Kawasaki FX921V engine.